Boston was slowly waking up in the cold March sunshine. The Merchant's Table, a trendy brunch bar on the corner of 5th and Grant Avenues, was crowded despite the early hour. There was a soft hum of business talk mixed with the clinking of glasses and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. At a table near the window sat two men in expensive suits, whose faces often appeared in the financial news. Ethan Carter, co-founder of Carter & Bennett Enterprises, stood confidently, leaning an elbow on the table. The 40-year-old billionaire, known not only for his fortune but also for his reputation as a man of his word, looked especially focused today. Across from him, with a slight smile on his face, sat Cole Bennett, his business partner, with whom they had grown from a garage startup to an international holding company. They were celebrating an important moment. Tomorrow was the signing of a contract with the Chinese investment fund Zhong Capital. The deal of the century, as they were already calling it on the sidelines. The terms of the contract promised expansion into Asian markets and doubling of the company's capital. The room had been carefully chosen for this breakfast, a private setting, a minimum of prying eyes. Ethan placed his palm on the screen of his smartphone, glancing at the name that popped up, Richard Lowenstein, managing partner of a New York fund. He got up from the table, tossed out a quick, "Just a minute, Cole, it's Richard," and headed for the terrace exit without waiting for a response. Cole was alone. His gaze slid down the hall, lingered for a moment on the window, behind which the morning cars were whizzing by, and suddenly he stood up. This did not escape the notice of Lucy Miller, a young waitress who was only working here for the second month. She noticed Cole walk confidently toward a man in a gray coat standing by the window. The stranger was holding a thin envelope, the kind you put business documents in. Lucy stood at the counter, ostensibly checking the order, but kept her eyes on the scene. Cole took the envelope, nodded and said something, gesturing for the man to stay put. The stranger replied briefly, his gaze cold and intense. The conversation didn't last more than a minute, but it was enough for something strange to hang in the air. Lucy couldn't hear the words, there were too many noises around, but the gestures, the looks, the restrained movements spoke for themselves. This was not a friendly meeting, not an exchange of greetings between two old acquaintances. There was an undercurrent of menace in this scene, something out of the ordinary for the business world. She pretended to adjust her tray, and out of the corner of her eye noted the way Cole squeezed the stranger's hand a little longer than he should have. At one point Cole looked over his shoulder as if afraid of being seen, and their gazes crossed for a second. Lucy quickly averted her eyes. The man in gray was the first to leave, slipping easily between the tables and exiting through the side exit. Lucy couldn't help herself. Going to the window, she noticed a dark blue sedan parked at the curb. The license plates were New Jersey plates. Her heart suddenly beat faster as she automatically pulled out the notebook she usually used to write orders in and carefully wrote down the license plate number. Cole returned to the table, once again becoming the charming partner that dozens of investors were accustomed to dealing with. He had finished his coffee by the time Ethan returned to his seat. The man jokingly tossed it back. "Well, I hope you didn't get overbought without me?" Cole only smiled, shrugging his shoulders. Lucy, watching them from behind the counter, tried to convince herself that this was all just an odd coincidence. Maybe she had misunderstood something. Maybe it was the courier or the counselor. But then why that strange look, why such a rush? She stood, slowly wiping the glass pitcher, and suddenly caught herself thinking that she wanted to forget what she had seen. To stay out of it. It was none of her business. She's a waitress, not a detective. And yet, something inside kept her mind off it. She glanced at the number she'd written down, then at Ethan and Cole chatting serenely. She decided to keep it to herself for now. For now. Dusk had fallen on Boston, painting the streets with the soft light of street lamps and the reflection of storefronts. In the South End neighborhood, where cramped streets alternated with neat brick houses, Lucy staggered home after her shift. The cold wind chilled her to the bone, and she pulled her thin coat tighter around her, dreaming only of a cup of tea and the warmth of a blanket. But when she turned onto her street, her heart stopped for a moment. At the curb in front of her house, stood that same dark blue sedan with New Jersey license plates. Inside, illuminated by the dim streetlight, sat two men, Cole Bennett behind the wheel and the man in the gray coat in the passenger seat. Lucy froze, hiding behind a billboard. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see Cole gesticulating, occasionally tapping his fingers irritably on the steering wheel. The man in gray spoke less but kept his voice calm, almost defiant. Their meeting didn't look like a random stop, they were clearly discussing something and without anyone seeing. Cole glanced at his watch, waved his hand sharply as if to end the conversation, and the car engine started. Lucy ducked behind the shield, her heart pounding. She didn't know why, but the feeling that she was witnessing something that wasn't about business at all was growing stronger by the minute. At that very minute, in downtown Boston, Ethan was sitting in Carter and Bennett's office on the 25th floor of a glass skyscraper. Lines of the contract flashed on his laptop screen, but his eyes were blank. For the second day in a row, Cole had avoided direct discussion of the key points of the deal with Joan Capital. Everything seemed to be ready, proven lawyers agreed upon terms, but as soon as Ethan tried to discuss the details, Cole either waved it off or turned the conversation to something else. It wasn't like Cole. He'd always been straightforward, sometimes even overly harsh on business matters. But now it was as if someone had put an invisible wall between them. Ethan couldn't understand what was bothering him more: his partner's strange behavior or his own suspicions. The thought was interrupted by a persistent knock on the door. It was his assistant, carefully placing a small envelope on the desk with no return address. "Brought by courier and signed," she said briefly and went out. Ethan took the envelope, feeling a chill run down his spine. Inside was a photograph. A crisp snapshot. Cole was standing outside a black sedan, talking to the same man in gray. The photo had been taken on the street, obviously surreptitiously, and judging by the angle from the second floor of some building. Ethan held his breath, scrutinizing the faces. His knees felt woozy. He recognized the place. It was the South End and definitely not the office district. Two feelings were struggling inside. The first reaction was that this was some kind of mistake. Someone had decided to play on his nerves, perhaps the competition. But the second feeling, deaf and clammy, whispered that no, this was real. And if even a fraction of what he'd seen was true, he needed to know the full extent of it. For the first time in years, Ethan realized he couldn't do this alone. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger froze on the name Marcus Hill. A private detective he'd trusted since he'd helped him with a nasty corporate case a few years ago. Without thinking, he dialed the number. Marcus's voice was as calm and confident as ever. Ethan briefly outlined the situation and made an appointment for the next morning. While Marcus promised to check everything out, Ethan felt an unpleasant sense of surveillance growing inside. And it didn't deceive him. In the morning, going down for coffee at the cafe on the first floor of their business center, he noticed a strange detail. The barista, a guy named Nate, had discreetly slipped him a napkin along with his cup. Ethan unfolded it in the elevator. There were only 3 words on it: "He's back with him." Ethan froze. This was no longer a coincidence. It meant only one thing: someone he barely knew was following Cole and informing him. He looked toward the transparent elevator wall that reflected his own face, and for the first time in a long time he saw uncertainty in his eyes. The vortex of doubt was swirling around him more and more. Marcus did not wait long. By noon the next day he sent Ethan a short message: "We have a name." Soon afterward they met in the office on the 25th floor. Marcus tossed a thin folder on the desk with neatly organized photos and printouts. The man in gray turned out to be more than just some random partner. His name was Alan Royce. He was an official representative of Vega Equity Partners, a Los Angeles-based investment fund with a less-than-clean reputation. Marcus knew everything there was to know about the firm: aggressive takeovers, brokered buyouts, backroom deals, pressure on shareholders. Vega was famous for entering companies as strategic investors and then completely ousting the founders after a year or two. Ethan leafed through the documents, and something akin to a deafening rage grew in his chest. Alan Royce had nothing to do with their deal with Joan Capital. He wasn't even supposed to be anywhere near Cole. Marcus had explicitly said that Royce didn't fly to Boston just for fun, especially for short meetings in a car on the outskirts. And yet Ethan couldn't bring himself to finally believe that Cole was plotting a setup against him. They had known each other for over 15 years. They'd pledged their first capital together, survived their first financial collapse together. They were bound not only by contracts, but also by a shared history, a trust that seemed to be time-honored. And yet, for the last few days, Cole had deliberately avoided discussing the details of the contract, hurrying Ethan more and more to sign the papers. He said that the Chinese were nervous, that delaying was dangerous to their reputation. Ethan was beginning to catch himself that every such remark sounded too insistent. Cole smiled, remained charming, made jokes at business meetings, even invited Ethan to dinner to celebrate a deal that hadn't even happened yet. But there was a strange through note in all of this, as if Cole himself was in a hurry to close the matter before Ethan realized anything. At some point Ethan realized he couldn't stay away any longer. He decided to talk to Lucy directly. Perhaps she knew more than she revealed. They met in the evening at a small cafe not far from the office. Ethan arrived alone, without security or assistance, as if he wanted to emphasize that this was not a business conversation. Lucy arrived a little later, wary, but without the usual waiter's modesty. Ethan didn't beat around the bush. He asked bluntly if she knew who the man was and what she thought of their meetings with Cole. Lucy stared out the window for a long time as if gathering her thoughts. She didn't tell everything, didn't give all the details, but she told a story that made Ethan's heart ache. Her father ran a small construction company in Massachusetts. When business started to pick up, his best friend, with whom they grew up together, offered to invest in the business. A year later, the company went bankrupt and the friend left to join a competitor. Dad lost everything. Lucy said she had been a child at the time, but since then she had known one thing. You should trust, but it was always better to check than to regret it. That conversation hadn't given Ethan the facts, but it had given him what was more important: clarity about his own doubts. He realized that he no longer had the right to ignore what his intuition was telling him. While Cole continued to play the old friend and loyal partner, Ethan decided that he had to tread carefully. He couldn't openly accuse, that would give Cole a head start and a chance to cover his tracks. He had to catch him red-handed. Not with words, not with suspicion, but with action. And Ethan realized that the next meeting would be a trap. Marcus worked silently but carefully. 2 days after their last meeting, he placed a thin but weighty folder on the table in front of Ethan. Inside were copies of email correspondence, excerpts of office correspondence, and scanned drafts of agreements. The documents clearly showed that Cole had been negotiating with Vega Equity Partners since late last year, offering them access to Carter and Bennett's corporate data. It was a subtle arrangement. Under the guise of a consultative partnership, Cole was actually preparing Vega for a takeover of the company, and Ethan for the role of a convenient scapegoat. The plan was simple: make a deal with the Chinese fund, and when it supposedly fails, lay the blame on Ethan, present him to the board of directors as an incompetent partner, and at the right moment push Vega as a savior investor. Ethan flipped through the last few pages, where Vega's name was in black and white in the draft alternative agreement. A cold wave burned him from the inside out. This was no mistake. Cole had indeed been preparing the betrayal with complete confidence in his impunity. The next day Ethan called Cole and suggested a business breakfast to finalize the details before signing. Cole agreed at once, even with some ostentatious joy. He suggested the same cafe where they usually met for informal talks. Ethan pretended that it suited him just fine. Ethan contacted Lucy that same evening. He didn't go into details, but he asked her to come at the same time to the same brunch bar where he'd arranged with Cole. Asked her to be close by, not to sit at their table but to observe closely. Lucy agreed without further question. Ethan knew she could be trusted. He counted on her attentiveness and cool mind. It was an ordinary morning: March sunshine, light fog, the unhurried rhythm of the waking city. Ethan arrived at the cafe 20 minutes before the meeting and took a table by the window. Lucy sat at the counter, ostensibly waiting for her shift to start. Cole showed up at the appointed time, chipper as ever, with confidence on his face and an expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. Breakfast began quietly. Cole joked, asked about Ethan's family, casually reminded them of old friendships. They ordered coffee, and then Ethan slowly pulled a signed copy of the contract out of his briefcase, leaving a few lines blank beforehand. He slid the papers over to Cole, watching his reaction carefully. Ethan then pointed to one of the clauses in the agreement, the one dealing with the terms of compensation if the Chinese fund backed out of the deal. It was a new clause that Cole himself had added in the latest revision sent to the lawyers 2 days ago. Ethan asked a direct question: why were the compensation terms spelled out like that? Cole said without blinking an eye that it was a requirement of Zhong Capital's lawyers. Ethan didn't look away, didn't smile. He knew for certain that the Chinese fund's lawyers hadn't even seen the clause. Moreover, it was Cole's own initiative. It was the clause that would allow Vega to intervene if the deal fell through. Cole continued to lie calmly and confidently, as if he had rehearsed it in advance. Ethan felt everything inside him shrink into one cold spot. It was at that moment that his phone screen flashed a new message from Marcus. Ethan opened it under the table. There was an audio file attached and a short note, recording of their meeting yesterday. Royce and Cole discussed the terms of the takeover. Inside, things began to fall into place. Ethan paused, glanced at Cole and said quietly, "Are you sure this item is really Zhong's demand?" Cole was confused for a moment, then put the familiar mask back on his face and grinned, calling Ethan paranoid. He said he was playing detective and seeing conspiracies where none existed. Ethan didn't answer. He slowly closed the file folder and turned his head toward the counter. At that moment Lucy, who had remained in the shadows until now, stepped forward and without raising her voice said, addressing Ethan, "I saw him meeting with that man. It was outside my house. More than once." Cole turned sharply toward her, his smile gone. A ringing silence hung around for a moment. Ethan stared at him silently, keeping his gaze fixed on her. The web Cole had spent so long and carefully weaving was beginning to tear right before his eyes. A week after that breakfast, when Cole had tried to dispense with a slight chuckle and accusations of paranoia, the hall of the convention center in downtown Boston was filled with key figures from Carter and Bennett Enterprises. It was an unscheduled shareholder meeting initiated by Ethan personally. The agenda sounded formal, a discussion of the current state of affairs and international development strategy. But everyone who entered the room could feel the tension that hung in the air. Ethan stood at the podium, dressed impeccably as always, but his voice sounded not the usual business courtesy, but confident rigidity. Next to him on a separate table stood a folder with documents, a laptop with a presentation, and a projector connected to a large screen. In the first part of his presentation he briefly described the dynamics of negotiations with Jeune Capital, outlined the importance of the upcoming deal, and then calmly moved on to the main part. Ethan successively showed documents, photos and printouts of email correspondence. On the screen flashed pictures taken at different times. Cole in the car with Royce, Cole in meetings in hotel lobbies, excerpts from Vega Equity's proposal emails. Accompanying each slide with a short commentary, Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse, he showed the facts. The hall was silent. Shareholders, board members, senior partners stared at the screen with faces that gradually developed an expression of cold understanding. The amount of evidence was overwhelming. Ethan gave the floor to Marcus, who confirmed the authenticity of the material by providing printouts of financial transactions between Cole and Vega's affiliated entities. Cole sat at the long presidium table, at first calmly, then stone-faced. When Ethan finished his presentation, Cole stood up. His voice sounded confident, even defiant. He accused Ethan of fabricating evidence, of trying to eliminate his business partner and only true friend for personal power. Cole played the role of the loyal co-founder who had been slandered. He tried to suggest to the board that what was going on was a planned campaign to discredit him. But before anyone could react, Lucy stood up. She stood in the front row next to Marcus. Her voice was steady and clear. She said that she had personally seen Cole in meetings with Royce on more than one occasion, and those meetings had taken place away from the company offices. She confirmed that she had relayed the information to Ethan when she realized that what was happening was no accident. That moment proved decisive. The direct testimony of an outsider not involved in the corporate games was stronger than any excuses. When Marcus showed authentic audio recordings of Cole and Royce's conversations, there was no doubt in the room. The vote of the board of directors took place almost instantly. The decision was unanimous. Cole was immediately suspended from all positions in the company, an internal investigation was launched, and Carter and Bennett's lawyers were instructed to prepare a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty and attempted raid. As the meeting drew to a close, Ethan took the floor again. He thanked everyone for their confidence but gave special thanks to Lucy. He called her courage an example for everyone in the company and offered her a new position as a corporate ethics and internal control consultant. Applause erupted in the hall, not out of politeness but sincere applause. Lucy stood a little to the side, not fully believing that this was actually happening. Ethan walked over to her, put his hand on her shoulder, and told her that without her honesty and courage, things might have ended very differently. They walked out of the hall together. It was drizzling lightly outside, but the air felt fresh and clear. Ethan looked at Lucy and said that the company needed people like her and that today she was part of a team he could really count on. A few days later, Lucy walked for the first time into the spacious office on the 23rd floor where her office was now located. Without a waiter's tray, without other people's orders, without fear or doubt. This was her new start, well-deserved, well-suffered, honest. And for the first time in a long time she felt that she was standing exactly where she should be. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.